After I finished high school, there was a kid in the class below me. And at this point, he wasn't really a kid anymore. He was an adult. And he had a really promising life ahead of him. Was into sports, was into sailing, got married at a young age, had a lovely wife. And then he came down with terminal brain cancer. Now, they had insurance, they had the best medical care available, and they fought it for several years. But eventually it got to the point where there was no medical reason to expect for him to live. And he decided on his own, apparently without the input of anyone else, to take his own life. He took a gun and he shot himself. And there's no question that this was a very tragic scenario. His wife was obviously devastated, her family, his family, all of his friends. I wasn't close to him, but my brother was. And it was definitely a really terrible situation. But his death has now been invoked, at least in terms of a statistic, as an argument in favor of restricting gun rights for everyone in the country. Now, why is that? Well, because he died from a gunshot wound, even though he was, in fact, dying of cancer and that he had committed suicide, his death is now considered an example of gun death or gun violence. These are two terms that are ubiquitous in the gun control, gun rights debate. You hear them all the time. You'll hear things like 90 people a day in the United States die of gun violence, or there's 30,000 gun deaths every year. And while those numbers are true to the extent that there may in fact be that many people who die every day or every year because of a gunshot wound, it's disingenuous and intellectually dishonest or ignorant, depending on who's using the term, because it is equivocating at least three and possibly even more categories of very different types of death. All right, there's a massive ethical and practical difference between suicide and homicide, for instance. And those are the two largest categories that we're going to find in this group of gun deaths. Many people who speak this, I think, are ignorant. They've heard the term, they don't like guns, so they repeat the term. And they're often surprised to find out that 2/3 of that number, well over half, something over 60% probably, are suicides. Now, suicides are tragic. Every suicide is different. We can look at a case like the one I just described, where the person is terminally ill, and this may not be a totally irrational decision on their part. And then there are other suicides where a person is not necessarily terminally ill and they're just upset in some other way and make a terrible decision. But even that is not the same as a homicide, where another person's life is taken without their consent, against their will. And there's a intellectual bait and switch that goes on, because when people hear gun violence, they assume homicide. In fact, a lot of people are going to assume homicide that involves, say, small children, completely innocent parties, which does happen, which is a small fraction of the overall homicides, which tend to be relatively violent young men with criminal records most of the time, not all the time. But they don't imagine that most of those deaths, most of that gun violence, is suicide. And then there's a third category that's much less common than the other two. Those would be accidental gun deaths. And then within that, there's also a category that I don't think is well documented of what you could say are justifiable gun deaths or justifiable homicides. So these would be self-defense gun uses that are legitimate, that are legal. There's several hundred of those a year. There's also 1,000 people a year who are killed by police. Now, some of these people are probably killed wrongly, and some of these people are probably killed rightly. And unfortunately, the government does not keep track of how many people they actually shoot. They don't, and they certainly don't have any kind of unbiased estimate of how many of those people were legitimate homicides and how many of them were not. But that 1,000 is actually a fairly significant portion of the total number of gun violence in the country. And then we could also do a similar breakdown for suicides. I think some of those suicides, like the one that I started off the video with, it's hard to see how that is the moral tragedy of, say, somebody who spur of the moment decides to kill themselves or to kill someone else. On the other hand, there are some cases that are more tragic than others. Now, the problem with using this term is that it's equivocating these different scenarios, which are ethically all different from each other. And not only are they ethically different and morally different, they're different in terms of what policies might plausibly stop them. So some of these deaths could be attributed by gun regulations and some of them could not. And the problem, the bait and switch that's going on here is that in most people's minds, they are thinking about homicide. And when they hear this large number, they imagine that's how many homicides there are, when in fact there's probably 10 to 11,000 gun homicides. 9% of those are being committed by the police. Some of the remainder are committed by civilians that are legal. I think the number of accidental deaths is quite small. It's in the hundreds, I think. I don't think it crests 1,000, but it may. Don't quote me on that, but it's a much smaller number. So this really, really muddies the water. All right, because so a policy that might there's several policies, like a lot of gun control would do stuff about the number of people who are killed by guns. They would reduce gun violence by shifting the means that people commit suicide by. So if we were to have a total gun ban, this would probably not affect criminals nearly as much as it would affect normal people. You would still have gun homicides happening, just as you still have gun homicides happening in all the countries that have banned guns. But guns would not be as readily available to law-abiding citizens who are suicidal. Now, those people would still commit suicide, though, and this is the big problem. You would have a shift in suicide from gun suicides to other means, whether it's wrist slitting, asphyxiation, leaping is a popular one, hanging, and it's questionable to see what the ethical distinction is between these, right? I won't say my friend because he wasn't, I did not know him well, but if this person from my school had hung himself rather than shot himself, I defy anyone to explain to me why the former is preferable in any sense to the latter. Why a woman who slits her wrists and bleeds out is less of a tragedy than if she were to shoot herself in the head with a gun. And you will see that places that have restricted guns will see a decline in gun violence in this term, in this sense. In fact, if you look if you look at the 50 states and you correlate gun ownership rates with gun deaths or gun violence, you will see that they are correlated pretty strongly. And I've had gun supporters come and say, "Hey, look, gun control supporters saying, look at this. The states with the most guns per capita have the most gun violence per capita, or the most gun deaths." You'll see this a lot, but it's like, if you break it down, though, that correlation is driven entirely by suicide. If you just look at homicide, either gun homicide or overall homicide, there is no correlation at all. So we have a situation where a ban might shift, and there are different studies on this. There are some studies that suggest that guns are a very effective form of suicide. So presumably if we have 20,000 gun suicides in the United States every year, and guns were completely banned, well, that doesn't mean that 20,000 people wouldn't kill themselves. You'd still have those people trying to kill themselves, but some of them on the margin, 5%, 10%, might fail. And instead of being dead, they might have a broken hip or brain damage or sliced up wrists, but not be dead because they failed. There is some research that suggests that on the margins, there are some people who may be more likely to commit suicide because they have a gun available than they're not. There's conflicting research on that. But even if we accept the stuff that's valid and we just assume that it's true, it's marginal, right? We're not talking about 20,000 people. We're talking about 1,000 people or 2,000 people. And that's a debatable number as well. So it's, and that's assuming that you did a complete gun ban. And that's the least likely gun control to ever be implemented. But that would definitely affect gun violence, but it would not really reduce the actual number of suicides. And classic example here, and I've gotten in a debate in one of my previous videos. He was saying that Japan has figured this out. Japan doesn't have any gun deaths. Japan's got everything worked out great. But if you look, Japan's suicide rate is several times that of the United States, and I believe it's enough higher that it's actually greater. The total number of people who are dying in Japan is greater than the total number of suicides and homicides in the United States. So you have more people in Japan dying of violent deaths. Certainly more suicides in the United States. I believe it's more than both. People can check that if they'd like. So yeah, sure, they have a gun ban, and these suicides are not being committed with guns; they're being committed with knives and whatever other means are used in Japan. I'm assuming it's mostly knives, but I don't know. And this is supposed to be some kind of great victory, a moral victory, a great improvement over them committing suicide with handguns or shotguns. So there's that. Now the other category here are accidents, and that's one that also would go down. See, if we banned guns or restricted guns, there would be fewer gun deaths from accidents. But again, this is a different moral category. Most of the people who are going to die of accidental gun discharges are people who like guns, who enjoy guns and spend a lot of time with them. If you don't own any guns, if you don't go shooting, the odds you're going to die in a gun accident are minuscule. They're minuscule anyway. They've been trending down. Guns are becoming safer and safer. Gun safety is becoming more ingrained within the gun culture. There's been a big shift in what's considered appropriate and inappropriate behavior with guns, to the point that the rates of people who are dying accidentally are going down. I read an account once of how there was a certain type of shotgun that if you, in order to disassemble it to clean it, you basically had to point the barrel at your chest. And if, of course, the gun wasn't loaded, that wasn't a problem. But if it was, and you accidentally discharged the weapon, you would kill yourself. So gun manufacturers obviously don't want that to happen, and have created safer, more reliable models that don't require that. But again, there's no moral equivalency here between an accidental gun death and a homicide, which is what people have in their head when they hear gun violence or gun deaths. So I own a lot of guns. I love guns. I don't shoot them very often, but there are times when I do, and there's a chance, albeit an extremely small one, that I could be killed in a gun accident. Well, it would be completely asinine for somebody to look at my death and then say, this is an argument for gun control, for gun restrictions. I would not want that. I'm a gun supporter. I'm a gun rights advocate. I think guns should be as available to people as they want and shouldn't be restricted at all. And yet my death would be statistically used as an argument for the exact opposite position. Right? Just like the exploited death of my high school associate, I'll say, I don't know what his views on gun control were. That's completely irrelevant, but his death is not an indication of a need for gun control at all. There's a conversation that we can have about suicide, about what are the ethics of suicide, but it's absolutely asinine to compare, Jack Kevorkian with Dylan Klebold. A person, suicides are not on the same ethical level, nor are accidents. Most of the people who are dying in gun accidents are people who love guns. And there are people going to say, well, look, all deaths should be avoided. If we can ban guns to stop those deaths from happening, then it should be done. How many people die in motorcycle accidents? No one needs a motorcycle. Motorcycles are recreational vehicles, right? And there's people who enjoy them. There's a much greater risk that they're going to die if they're ever in an accident, which statistically some of them are going to be in accidents. Should we ban bicycles? Should we ban scuba diving? Because scuba divers die. Should we ban base jumping or rock climbing or mountain climbing or hiking or hunting or any activity at all where there are accidental deaths? Swimming. People drown. People drown all the time. It's actually not a very, in absolute terms it's relatively rare, but in terms of causes of death, it's not the least common. So should we ban all people from swimming? Because swimming is not necessary, right? There's very few, if any, people who require swimming. And so the logic here is very inconsistently applied. Very few people who would jump and say, well, we should ban guns to stop people dying in accidental gun discharges would then say, well, we should ban people from scuba diving, we should ban people from skydiving, we should ban people from base jumping, we should ban people from mountain climbing. And if you look at something like Mount Everest, something like 10% of the people who attempt to climb Mount Everest die. Historically, the rates have shifted over the years. And I think most people recognize, well, maybe I wouldn't want to do it. If someone else wants to take the risk, that's their life, that's their right to do that, and they shouldn't be banned because you wouldn't take the risk or because their potential death bothers you so much. It's their life. If they want to risk it climbing Mount Everest, that's their business. And if I want to risk accidentally shooting myself, which is a risk that's orders of magnitude less than the risk I would be taking if I were to climb Mount Everest, or attempt to climb Mount Everest rather, then that's also my business, and that's not something that really you should worry about. Now you can have the hypothetical scenario and say, well, what if you accidentally kill somebody else? Sure, fair enough. I don't know what fraction of the accidental gun deaths are that. My guess is it's a very small one. Even there, the person you accidentally kill is likely another gun supporter. It's probably not that you're out at the range with all of your anti-gun buddies and then you accidentally shoot one of them. Could happen hypothetically, and I think I'll do another video about this, but hypothetical scenarios are great to an extent, but you have to weight them with their actual probability. So the probability that you kill another person accidentally is a lot lower than you killing yourself, and the probability that the person that you kill is going to be, there's a good chance, I won't say what the odds are, but there's a good chance the person that you might accidentally kill is a person who would not be in favor of gun control anyway. But we're now talking about very small numbers here, potentially dozens or single digits numbers of people who this would apply to, and to then say, well, we should ban guns from 300 million people or confiscate them for these small numbers does not make any sense. Now, homicide is an interesting category. It's the second largest, right? It's a lot less than suicide, about half the number of suicides. It's a lot more than accidents. But it's the category that is what fires people's imaginations. It's what people think about when they hear the term gun violence and gun suicide or gun deaths. They think homicides. Now the problem here is that this is the most resistant statistic to change. All right, so if we banned guns or made guns more difficult to have, we had a 10% tax on guns, and so fewer people bought guns, or had longer waiting periods so fewer people went through the hoops, or a licensing program that allowed fewer people would choose to go through, or confiscation or whatever, these would definitely lower the numbers of people who commit suicide with guns. It would probably not change the overall suicide rate, but it would change the number of quote gun deaths, and it would certainly lower the number of gun accidental deaths. But it's not clear that it would have any effect on homicide. If we look at the classic cases of the UK and Australia, there's really no evidence that their gun restrictions had any effect on homicide whatsoever. The homicide rate in the United States has fluctuated independent of gun regulations and gun restrictions. It's gone down, it's gone up. And the reason for this is that crime is a complicated phenomenon, and that criminals are not statistics that are easily accounted for in your theories of, it's not as simple as, well, we ban it, then it won't be available. I agree that if you have heavy restrictions on guns, it will become more difficult for criminals to get guns. Absolutely. If guns are freely available, without question, without background checks, without anything, it's not going to be difficult for criminals to get guns most of the time. And if you make things more restrictive, it's going to be a little bit more restrictive for criminals to get guns. However, it's not so simple as to say, this will then lower homicide. For two reasons. One, you still have the same substitution problem that you have with suicide. People who are homicidal for whatever reason are probably still going to be homicidal whether or not they have guns available to them. Now, there's the argument of how effective. If they're homicidal with a knife, isn't that better than if they're homicidal with a gun? Sure, fair enough. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Although if you look, knives kill more people than most of the guns people seem really worried about. If you look at in terms of lethality, knives are much worse than rifles. That's all rifles, including the so-called assault weapons that people are so upset about. In fact, I think it's something like 10 times the number of people are killed with knives than are killed with so-called assault weapons, or at least AR-15s. Maybe not all assault weapons, but there's that consideration. But then there's the other problem, it's not just that guns are less common among everyone. The legal restrictions are going to affect law-abiding people a lot more. So if the firepower available to law-abiding citizens is reduced by 50%, criminals who are not going to follow the law, they're not going to pay the taxes, they're not going to go through the background checks, they're already obtaining their guns through theft, through illegal black markets. They're still going to need them for their criminal needs. They might have a harder time, but instead of a 50% reduction, they're going to have a 25% reduction in their guns. Okay. Now I'm drawing those numbers out of thin air, but the point is that there will be a relative increase in the firepower of criminals to law-abiding citizens. A relative increase. Um, Civilians will have a lot fewer guns. Criminals will have somewhat fewer guns. It's hard to see how that isn't a bad situation. It's very difficult to look at that and say, well, that's definitely going to be better. If homicidal people, if law-breaking people, if career criminals are more able, are more armed relative to their intended victims, then that is not a recipe for lower homicide rates. Far from it. Now, there are a certain class of criminal where this might work, right? There's certain classes of criminals who are the spontaneous criminal, the criminal who could pass any background check, who has no criminal record, who is not motivated by any kind of rational cost-benefit analysis or anything like that, and who just snaps and goes on a killing spree. And this is all very interesting. So people's ideas are kind of focused on this one, the mass shooter, the person who. Now, that's not. Most of our gun crime is not that. It's a very small percentage of our overall homicide is mass homicide. It's mostly related to the drug war and people fighting over turf or disagreements over black markets or crimes of passion, revenge for, infidelity or, money or something like that. It's not somebody who is going to say, I just want to kill as many people as possible. That does happen. That is a problem. But it's such a small part of the overall picture that focusing exclusively on it makes no sense statistically. It's unclear that we could do anything about that, really. And it's foolish to kind of focus on such a small sliver. It's dramatic. It gets the attention of a lot of people, and it drives the debate, but it's statistically the least important. It's one of those things like even if we solved that problem, but the overall homicide didn't change, what's the difference? Is everything that much better or worse? No. I mean, so again, we don't see a correlation with gun restrictions and homicide at all. Not in the UK, not in Australia, not in the United States, not in Brazil or Mexico or Russia or Japan or any of these other places. The thing that drives the entire argument are shifts from suicide from guns to other means and from accidental deaths. And that's a really disingenuous way to have this debate now. So the people who use this term, gun violence or gun deaths, either they're ignorant and they don't understand the distinctions that I'm outlining here. They're unaware that that's a lump sum that equivocates suicide, homicide, and accidental death. Or they are aware of that and they're being deliberately disingenuous. And if you see them on TV and they're saying this, then they're being deliberately disingenuous. So anyway, I just wanted to call everyone's attention to this. I think most of you probably already realize that, but whenever you hear this term, gun violence or gun deaths, be sure to look into it and break it down, because what we should do and how we should react and how we should address the numbers is really, really important to understand that they don't have the same, the things that cause someone to become homicidal, to go out and commit a homicide are not the same precursors that lead someone to commit suicide. And they're not the same precursors that lead someone to accidentally shoot, themselves or someone else. So anyway, I think that's it for this topic, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.